The content of this radio show is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health professional with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.
Welcome to One Soul Radio, an interactive conscious conversation grounded in psychology and inspired by spirit, with Steve Hasenberg and Cali Alpert.
Welcome, friends, to One Soul Radio here on Unity Online Radio. This is the show for you and by you, a virtual community creating conscious conversation and the opportunity to have a place to delve a little bit deeper in your life than you may do on your own. We are offering you a unique perspective from both worlds at the same time. My name is Cali Alpert, coming to you from the Central Hudson Valley in New York with my dear friend, co-host, and spiritual psychotherapist, Steve Hasenberg on the West Coast.
Hey, Cali.
Hey, Steve.
So nice to see you.
So nice to see you and hear you. We have the unfair advantage of seeing each other. Everyone else has to listen to us solely.
Unless they watch us on YouTube,
exactly,
which is coming up.
That's right. That's a good teaser. Thanks for that.
I'm really excited about the show today.
Good. Well, you have a personal stake in this one, deep stake in this one.
Very deep. And I'll be talking about my journey to Teotihuacan with Don Miguel Ruiz and spending about, I think, 3 years with him as part of his posse.
3 potent years.
Yeah.
So with that as our tee up, today our show is on the 4 agreements, the wisdom of Don Miguel Ruiz, and plus the special one-of-a-kind, never heard before on radio twist of Steve Hasenberg's 3 potent years with Don Miguel, traveling with him, befriending him, studying with him, and having some very trippy, far-out experiences and lessons come from it.
True.
So in his seminal best-selling book, Don Miguel Ruiz reveals ancient Toltec wisdoms to help undo the societal imprints that can obstruct our road to joy and freedom. And yes, our beloved Steve has firsthand stories to share through your unique lens. You're going to discuss, well, I guess together we'll discuss the agreements in a deeper way. You're going to share some of your wild stories and life-altering experiences. And we're going to apply the Toltec lessons to everyday life in the name of writing one's own story and embracing one's own truths. So let's start first with what the Toltec tradition is, which is Don Miguel's tradition. It's a 15-year-old, 1500.
It's a teenager.
Wow. I'm channeling the younger of many of souls of Don Miguel's. 1500 years old, right? And the 4 agreements is based on the ancient wisdoms that are...
Yeah, the Toltecs were actually one of the great cultures in the world. And by the 6th century AD, the area where they were for probably 600-700 years was called Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan means the place where humans wake up and remember that they are God.
Wow. It's so appropriate because I know some of your experiences there, but I didn't realize what that was the literal translation, nor can I pronounce that word as well as you can. So I always just say Teo and I cheat for short.
Teotihuacan, as a matter of fact, Teotihuacan was the 6th largest city in the world in the 6th century.
Now, is that also when other ancient civilizations, was that before like the Mayans, Incans, Aztecs?
The Aztecs came afterwards.
Okay.
The Mayans came before and after. The Mayans are still happening.
Right.
Don Miguel is part of the Toltec tradition, but the Toltec, they have these stories about how both the Mayans and the Toltecs kind of disappeared in one moment, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating because they still don't know why. You know, I have a special affinity for the Mayan culture because I feel like I was there in some lifetime, and I
Uh-huh.
also had a love affair with the Mayan man in Mexico many years ago. So I have a special affinity for that culture.
Well, we could talk
Um,
about that today.
no, we do not need to take away from the matters at hand today. But I mean, they were all they talk a lot about because there's no definitive explanation yet for how some of those civilizations suddenly sort of died, dispersed, fell off the face of the earth, whether it was their own sort of barbaric implosion with each other, if it was water shortages, right? I mean, there's so many different philosophies or like theories on how that happened, right?
Could be volcanoes.
Mm-hmm.
The Atlantean civilization, they think, was swallowed by the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
The Lemurian civilization was swallowed by the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Our civilization may be swallowed soon by the
Yeah,
ocean.
that'll be another show. How did you first start resonating with this? How did you, before we start
Sure.
breaking down the 4 agreements, how did you come to know Don Miguel and or his work? I don't know which one came first.
All right. Such an interesting question.
Maybe I'll
I,
interview you today, even though we didn't plan on
I
default
just
my interview mode.
I want to mention a word which is so interesting. Shamans can also be called naguals
Mm-hmm.
in Spanish. Nagual means that which cannot be known.
Mm,
Isn't that interesting?
beautiful.
So he's a nagual. He made me a nagual too.
You told me
And
about that ceremony.
and so I didn't have, this was prior to his fame. So I had no idea who he was. But 5 months prior to meeting him, I had a lucid dream. And in the lucid dream, I was in Mexico in an adobe house with about 3 other people, and it was candle lit. And as we sat there, having no idea what was going to happen, this beautiful man came into the room with long, flowing black silver hair, with beautiful, gorgeous beads, and opulent rings on his fingers. And he sat down in front of us. And as he sat down, this fierce wind began to blow through the room. And we were all kind of awed, but in shock and a little scared. And then the wind subsided. And then he said to us, "Watch me." And as we watched him, he became 3 figures, then 2 figures, 1 figure. And I was so moved by this that I went up to him. He took my hand and I said, "How did you do this?" And he said, "You know. What I've done has been as close to you as your beating heart." And I woke up.
Wow. And then
That's a
what happened?
prelude to what
Yeah.
happened.
What happened 5 years later so we can land that story?
Right? So 5 months later,
Oh, 5 months later. I'm sorry.
it's all right. 5 months later, my sister-in-law called and she said, "I have a new boyfriend." And I said, "Great." She said, let's go out to breakfast with him." So she showed up with Don Miguel Ruiz. And so Don Miguel, we drove out to Malibu for breakfast. He was sitting next to me and I thought, well, she said he's a shaman. I'm going to talk to him about my dream. And so I said, "I want to tell you about a shaman dream I had." He said, "Tell me everything." And I told him about the dream. He kept saying, "What did the guy look like? What was he wearing? What was his presence like?" And I told him, and I said, "Well, who was he?" And Don Miguel said, "You know who he was." And I said, "I don't know. Please tell me." He said, "You know who he was." I said, "I don't." We got to the point like I just screamed at him. And I
This
said,
is your first
"Just
date with him too, right?
first date, just tell me who he was." He said, "He was you. And you're coming with me to Mexico next week, and you have an appointment with power."
Nice to meet you too.
Right. Thank you
Just,
very much.
just another Sunday brunch in your world. So we're going to get to, I mean, I love that story. I love all your stories, and your Don Miguel stories have a special magic and potency. So we're going to share more of those throughout the course of the show. I just want to say also, if anybody would like to call in, share their relationship with this beautiful seminal book that so many people know, the Four Agreements, any questions that you may have, please feel free to call us, join the conversation at 816-251-3555. So shall we start with one of the agreements? We're going to try to, this book is so widely known. I'm going to gather most people that are attracted to listening to the show today are familiar. So what we're going to aim to do, beyond weave Steve's stories throughout and his personal perspective, is to maybe just offer a little bit fresh perspective on each of them, or how you can maybe land them in a new way, or just to remind us all of these beautiful fundamentals. I know I always need reminding. So the first one is to be, and we're not going in any particular order. Frankly, I don't know if the order we wrote these notes is the order of the book. I didn't check. It is. Okay. Thanks for that. So the first one is be impeccable with your word. Right. So what comes under the subheadings underneath being impeccable with your word are everything from speaking with integrity to saying, and we added, and doing what only what you mean, so that your behaviors, your actions, and your words are truly aligned with who you are, what you represent, and what your truth is. And also to avoid using words against yourself or other people. So I know that you and I both have a history of not doing that really well. Right. And I think it comes in the form, often when we hear that, like, I think on the surface, one of the go-to interpretations of this is don't be mean, don't spew out words that are nasty or judgmental, try to be kind with your intention of what you express. But it's also about your word with yourself, your inner narratives, the way you talk about yourself, the way you judge yourself. I mean, I think it's all really interrelated. So we just want to keep it as 360, right? So how did you relate to this?
Well, let me give you
Concept.
a tad bit of background,
Yeah.
not just about me, but if you think of the Toltec civilization and you go through these four agreements, which is where it came from. So it's not like Don Miguel made this up. He may live it, right? But these were kind of ethical and moral codes from that civilization back in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. And when we look at it that way, and they say impeccability with the word, and we think of our culture, you begin to have some feeling of the difference. So their highest standards are in these four agreements. Impeccability with the word, for me, when I first heard it, I thought, wow, I haven't been doing that very well.
I know, nor me. I know.
Because as our listeners know, I've been, not anymore, but I have been the world's greatest placater, the greatest pleaser, which I learned rigorously in my childhood. And I try to please everybody and try to fulfill their needs while not fulfilling my own.
Right.
So this is not impeccability with the word.
Right. And it's such an important way to look at this too, again, because there's so many different versions of what impeccability means. First of all, just going back to what you said, I love that the Toltec tradition holds these very stripped down. I mean, the way this book and Don Miguel relayed this out into the world is so stripped down, and it's really great to just go back and just to be reminded, and I love the fact that it kind of holds a high standard in a culture and a society and a civilization. I just think that's so beautiful. It just
Gorgeous,
gives it a whole
right?
other, I don't know, a whole other level of, it's not just about, us as individuals trying to be good people. The idea that it's almost like a social norm or more, to me, is quite beautiful and powerful. Yeah, I was really good. I still can be good at it. I've gotten a lot better at not being good at it. Especially like placating boyfriends, and not even I don't even know if that's the right word, but just not speaking my own truth or my own needs, making it much more about their needs and their truths, and making way more space for that than my own. And then ultimately, historically, it always imploded on me because I knew inside it didn't feel right, but I didn't have any tools to recognize or have some witnessing of what I was doing. I think for me, one of the other challenges that I experience this a lot, because maybe now I'm the opposite, is of really always wanting, this well with me, for better or worse, because I take you through this too, is that I really like to keep things extremely clean, like all the time, as much as possible with everyone in my life, in terms of where our space is at. If anything sort of sits in discomfort or murkiness or ickiness or lack of understanding, it's really uncomfortable place for me to be often. And also my intention's pure. It's to just keep everything as healthy and open and transparent as possible, but it doesn't get well received often. It scares people, or maybe it comes too early in relationship, or maybe it's too much on the wrong day. I don't know. But that's hard for me, when you want to be impeccable with your word and your intention, and then there's no like receptivity for it, or you're at least in different spaces with that. How do you deal with that?
Well, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking a lot has to do with timing,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
So
that's true.
as we go through this list, it's important for everyone to remember that this is a big ask. Every agreement is a very big ask. And it does represent indigenous standards. We always talk about the indigenous people, and most of those cultures had very, very high spiritual standards, which we have unfortunately lost, right? And
hopefully we're moving back in that direction, because the materials, imploding, being shown to us that it might not work. Maybe we don't want to be as attached to it as we thought we did.
Exactly. You and I are good at holding these standards, right? We do our best, and that's the fourth agreement. We do our best with them. And
thanks for that, by the way. A little meta with the 4 agreements. We're going to do our best with the 4 agreements.
Right.
Oh, wow. All right. We'll have to talk about that more when we get to that one.
I just wanted to say, I'm going to keep throwing in these things that are so interesting. So the Toltec culture was a culture of enlightened priests and common people. Everybody in the culture was on a spiritual path. There were different levels of that spiritual path, represented by there are 7 different architectural aspects of Teotihuacan, both courtyards and pyramids, and the Jaguar Palace, which I'll talk about. And as people graduated with this knowledge, this wisdom, they would go from one aspect to the other till they get to the 7th level, which was symbolized by the pyramid of the sun. There was the pyramid of the moon, pyramid of the sun, Jaguar Palace. And so this was a culture, maybe like with Plato or Socrates, that was progressing and developing spiritually as they lived in this ancient time.
Wow. I never thought about it like that. I don't know enough about Teo, but I just like that visual, that concept makes me cry almost.
Isn't it
the
gorgeous?
Idea that was such a palpable part of their everyday life, the idea of that sort of graduation and priority of your spiritual nature and spiritual trajectory as a conscious, active, collective, societal thing is just really powerful. That's
Isn't
beautiful.
it?
Wow. I love that.
Right.
Yeah. Makes me wish we had more of that, but we can do what we can do, right?
Right.
Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Well, something you'd be interested in. There was a section for women, and it was kind of a deep cave bath. There was water in the cave. It was almost like a women's baptism, and
Hmm.
we were able to go in there and see it. It was very dark. It was very moist.
Appropriate,
Right?
appropriate metaphor.
And it was the place where women took on their role of the sacred feminine,
Wow.
and they were initiated there by the priests. I mean,
You just
right?
can't. Yes, I know. Just hearing about you talk, as much as I thought I knew about this whole thing, I'm learning a lot, even just listening to these
Right.
references. So beautiful. Wow. So, in terms of kind of takeaways before we move on to the second
Right.
agreement, and the way we could maybe offer a little bit of a fresh spin would be that I think we're both in agreement that when you can create a little bit more space to witness your thoughts and feelings, you can be more impeccable, right? We talk a lot on the show about space with everything, with all of with reactions, with our thoughts, with our observations of ourselves, just creating. That's part of what mindfulness and meditation is all about. And it certainly applies here, right? That it kind of correlates to the idea of being impeccable with your word. If you can take a minute to breathe in between what your mind stream is saying and what your mouth wants to express, would that be a good suggestion for our listeners?
Yeah, they say take a breath,
Mm-hmm.
take a mindful breath.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we've always defined mindfulness on our show is take a step back for a
Yeah.
minute.
Yeah.
Take a look at what you're thinking. Take a look at what you want to say. Evaluate it. See if it's honest or authentic, real for you, and then go on and say it. So that would be closer. Impeccability of the word is a very progressive thing. Incremental, takes time. You have to start slowly. And maybe at some point in your life, you'll get to pure authenticity.
And it's just the idea of having the intention.
Right.
Really. I mean, I could go on just on this one. We're going to move on to the next, but I'm just thinking of so many people I hear that are constantly criticizing themselves out loud. That in and of itself could be something where you put $1 in the jar, I mean, just to start catching yourself. But
You,
the idea is at least to start thinking about these things and becoming a little bit more actively aware. So the second one we'll jump into is don't take anything personally. This is a hard one for most of us humans, right? That nothing others do is because of you. That it's very natural that, most of us have defensiveness, insecurity, reactivity. It is our human nature. And that as soon as somebody's doing something around us or not doing something around us, often it's because of us. I mean, I know I've been really good at this over my life as well. This person's not smiling today, it must be because of X, Y, and Z. Or, I mean, it's definitely one that I think is really common for a lot of people.
it's common for almost everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I talked about this the other day, that there's two words in psychology that kind of sum this up. And the words are field dependence
Yes,
and
thank you.
field independence.
Mm-hmm.
And they're great words. So field dependence means that you're depending on your environment for your identity. That could be your job, your family, your social status, who you know, and other people are very, very important when we're worried about our status, when we're worried about the way we dress, very important. On the other hand, field independence is much more autonomous and independent, and you don't care as much. And usually people who are field independent are much more developed, mature, they've worked on themselves, and they're not looking to the outside to verify who they are.
So important. And then there's everybody in the middle, which is most of us to some degree, right?
Yep.
Hi. Yeah. Raise your hand in the front row. Raising our hands. The other thing too about this one that I often question is the other side of the spectrum on this, which is that I also am a big believer in taking ownership of your stuff and not putting, some people run the risk of putting everything on someone else. So there's a distinction there that I think we're going to have to maybe spend a little bit of time on too, which is where is the line between not taking anything personally and separating yourself out and being completely field interdependent, but also taking responsibility and accountability for your stuff.
I think that's important. And there's also something called disassociation, where you're so field independent because you're afraid of the field and you don't want to have anything to do with it.
I would like to get better at that. That's going to be my New Year's resolution in January. I want to get better at that. So we're talking about kidding, but every once in a while, not kidding. We're talking about the 4 agreements. We're going to hear more stories from Steve. We're going to cover the other agreements. We're going to offer some action steps and do as much justice as we can to Don Miguel Ruiz. And we will be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to One Soul Radio here on Unity Online Radio. We are talking about the 4 agreements, honoring our teacher and friend, Don Miguel Ruiz, talking about each of the 4 agreements, hopefully with a little bit of a fresh spin, or at least just a way to kind of ground them and anchor them into your daily life. And my favorite part of the show, perhaps, is Steve's stories that he's able to share out of the years that he was friends, student of, apprentice, honorary Nagual, traveling with Don Miguel, learning from him. So before we get to Steve's next story, I just want to make sure that we wrap up the idea of that distinction between, we were talking about the second agreement of not making assumptions. I'm sorry, not don't take anything personally. And I wanted to make the distinction between how nothing is because of you and somebody else does something, it's not because of you, but also making sure that we take accountability and really own our stuff as much as we can without disassociating or attaching it solely to somebody else. So how do we make that distinction, psychotherapist Sensei?
Well, here's the thing. The distinction has to be made through inner work. I mean, you can do it intellectually, but it's not easy.
Right.
The distinction is made as we resource ourselves more and more, and as we overcome a lot of the narratives that are negative about ourselves. And as we do that, we become less and less dependent on others. And so we can kind of see through, if that's the best word, see through where other people are,
right,
what their motives are, what their fears are, and understand that those things belong to them. And the thing that Don Miguel was always fond of saying is that most everything belongs to everybody.
Right. Separately, we're all in our own separate silos. So we only own our reactions to art, right?
Right. Everything belongs to everybody. And we're taking everything that belongs to everybody and making it our own.
Oh, I see. I was twisting that in the wrong way. Okay.
No, it's all, what you said is true too. So as you get more, as you go deeper into yourself, you become more sovereign. And in that sovereignness, you become automatically more autonomous and independent. But that takes time. And we're all at different places. Everybody's at a different place. That's what makes the world a beautiful and crazy, the crazy place that it is.
Yeah, it's true. We all are made the exact same way. We all want the same, like 3 to 5 bottom line things.
Don't we?
And then we muck it up with all these stories and narratives, and as Don Miguel would say, our indoctrinations. And then we have to sort of unlearn that and let it go.
So true.
And unwind from it. And I just wanted to say one more piece about this, and then I want to hear your next story. I I didn't know when I was younger that I was defensive. In fact, I don't even remember as a kid. I was too busy trying to survive in our household. I certainly learned how defensive I was when I started being in relationships with men, and they would call me out on something. We'd have an argument about something. I could never hear it, never own it. And as I started to get into my own therapeutic work and spiritual work, and then created more space and and a lot of it had to do with building up a level of self-compassion and self-love, that you get to the place where I'm much closer now than I've ever been, where it's much harder to have your chord struck and triggered, which again, I certainly am not saying I'm without by any stretch, but so much less so than many years ago, because my own wholeness is much more mine. And I say it just because it's really an amazing, beautiful thing if you just simply decide to make it a priority, to start filling in your own heart and your own holes and gaps and wounds with your own love, and your own self-compassion. It's amazing how so much more dilutes, so much of the latter dilutes and sort of dissipates and vaporizes.
It reminds me of
Cool,
the
right?
fact that when I was in high school, I had to wear Brooks Brothers clothing in order to feel adequate.
Mm.
And nobody wore Brooks Brothers clothing in high school. I think I was kind of acting out my previous life in London. But if I didn't have my Brooks Brothers stuff, I would feel woefully inadequate.
Mm.
And sometimes I'd make excuses not to go to school.
Oh, I made excuses to not go to school too, because I was going to be horrible at like gym class. But anyway, that's very precious. And I know you're not like that anymore. No, you dress very nicely. I'm sure you don't care about that stuff anymore the way you did.
I have transcended Brooks Brothers.
So would you like to share your next Don Miguel story before we get to the other two?
Yeah, and so he told me, you have an appointment with power, which turned me on tremendously. And
given
then,
that big old ego of yours back then, right?
And then we got home from our breakfast, and I told Don Miguel before he left, I said, I'll see you next week. My wife gasped, and she said, you're not going to Mexico next week, are you? We didn't have much money. I said, yeah, I think I have to go, because he said I would understand my entire history there. And anyway, I went to Mexico. And during our first day there, Don Miguel took me into what's called the Palace of the Jaguar. The Palace of the Jaguar was the place where the priests lived during the 6th century, when they were guiding people through these different levels of spiritual attainment. And he said, I'm going to take you to the room where you lived. And I was like, whoa, okay. And we went down a long flight of stairs into this very dark kind of subterranean basement. And we got to this room, and it was pitch black. And he said, just look into that room and tell me what you see. And I stood there looking. I said, Don Miguel, there's nothing in here. It's just black. He said, just look with your other eyes. I didn't know what that meant. And all of a sudden, I saw this spinning light from the back of the room coming toward me. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it just absolutely entered me. And I was filled with this just sublime, overwhelming love that was so strong that I started weeping, and I was crying so hysterically out of happiness that I couldn't stand, and I fell on the floor. And it was a stone floor, and it was rather hard, and I fell on it. And as I fell, I tried to break my fall with my right hand. And as I was going through this experience of sublime love, divine love, I realized that my hand was touching a sandal. And I thought, that was like outrageous. And I looked up to this body and a face looking down at me, and the face was Jesus Christ.
Wow.
And in that moment, I was taken into heaven, and I felt everything heavenly about my earth experience. And I realized why I was born, and I realized what I was going to do here, but I was experiencing it all from a heavenly state.
Mm.
And I was crying so much and on the floor, kind of writhing, that the guards, there are guards outside of these architectural monuments, came running toward me shouting, "Medical, medical, medical." And Don Miguel and 3 other men carried me out of the Jaguar Palace. And the guards were saying, "Did he have a heart attack?" And Don Miguel was screaming at them that he didn't have a heart attack. He had this incredible experience. And there I was
Wow.
being held by Don Miguel in heaven with the sun coming down and having just experienced Jesus, and
Wow.
an experience of a lifetime.
So quickly, when you tell that story now, how does it feel right now to read?
It
Tell it.
still
Do you
brings
feel it?
tears to my eyes. It was so powerful. It's just so powerful.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's hard to top that. Should we just forgo the rest of the show? I mean, it's so powerful. It's just really, that's not even a one in a lifetime. That's like an otherworldly, it's very precious and special experience. And I know you won't say it, but at the end of the show today, we'll talk about the beautiful short story that you wrote that's published on Audible. If anybody wants to hear more of the longer version of it and read it, it's really, really beautiful. So let's talk about the other 2 agreements. The third one, don't make assumptions. I think this one is so important. I mean, they're all important, but this one also hits home on such deep levels. So some of the subheadings or sub-thoughts under don't make assumptions is to communicate clearly, don't write stories in your head, which we're all really good at, or I should speak for myself, I'm really good at. Often writing a story in our head is the way we're wired to keep us safe and in familiar territory, even though it can be like the death of us and not the wisest thing to do. It's sort of this reflex that's deeply ingrained, often karmically as well. We write the stories often before we even have the experience. So to just sort of remember these things and be a little more mindful of it. And as you've said, that assumptions are grounded in fear and hatred, right? I mean, assumptions now have taken on a whole other level, even in our country, politically and societally and culturally, where people are constantly looking at someone, they blink the wrong way, they have the wrong bumper sticker, and a whole story and assumption is made about them. It doesn't mean that we're off sometimes by certain things that are sort of stereotypic, but it also means that we are really just projecting our own fear of the other rather than giving them a chance or having a conversation or asking them why they dress that way or have that flag hanging out of their car window or whatever. I'm just, giving silly examples, but.
Something we mentioned on a previous show, which comes to mind, which is that in sociology, there are 4 different levels. One level is egocentric. The second level is ethnocentric. Third level is world-centric. And the 4th level is unity. We all know what egocentric is. Ethnocentric, when I looked it up, it said 70% of the people in the world now are ethnocentric.
70%?
Meaning 70.
Wow.
My group, better than your group.
Right, wrong.
My gender, better than your gender. My religion, better than your religion. My dog, better than your cat. And the 70%.
Wow.
So in terms of making assumptions, it's going on all the time.
Wow. And like you've said several times, hatred, which is sort of implicit in what you're describing, is really just unachieved love. If we
Right.
were all able to stop ourselves again, take a breath, and instead of writing a story about someone else, we took a minute to look at ourselves and what it is that's motivating us to have that judgment or that assumption, perhaps the world would be a better place. But I mean, how do we start? Again, what does that come down to? Does it still come down to stopping and creating space and being more mindful? It sounds like a cliche, but that's most of what everything we talk about comes down
It
to.
really is. And, stopping to remember that there's a wonderful movie on Netflix right now about the four normal humans that have just gone around into orbit around the Earth for 2 days. And the idea that the way they came back, with the way that William Shatner just came back from outer space, they all had the same experience. William Shatner came back from Jeff Bezos in orbit, and he was crying.
That was precious, that whole thing.
And he said he was crying because this thin blue line, which is our atmosphere, protects us from this infinite black space. And this infinity and this fragility of the Earth was so strong that he couldn't speak. If we can remember that, even for an instant, that we are circling around the sun, that we are part of billions of galaxies, and we're here as a gift from our soul, from the goddess, from the gods, and that we're here in order to treat everybody with love.
And to recognize that we're all doing it together. We're all actually having the exact same experience. And again, we just color it and write these narratives and indoctrinate ourselves with these stories that are really not true in the purest form. But if only we could remember. I wish I could remember a lot more often than I do.
Please remember.
Yeah.
And what do they say in the Toltecs? Remember means the members of ourself being woven back together so we become whole.
Ah, beautiful. That was really good. That's a nice remembrance. Thank you for that. And a nice segue. Was there anything else we wanted to say about assumptions before we move to our final agreement?
I'm very chatty today because you got me on my favorite topic. So I can say one other thing.
Please say two things.
Which I said to my client this morning, who's a screenwriter. I said, when you're writing fiction, and fiction is everything that we imagine in the future in our mind, write narratives that basically soothe you and support you rather than breaking you down and criticizing you. So in terms of making assumptions and narratives, let's do some that support us. Let's use our imagination in a positive way.
Right. That's the other thing. How did we get so far away? Why is it that we have such powerful imaginations, and yet often our imaginations toward the hopeful, the faithful, the positive is superseded by what seems to be more familiar, which is the narratives and assumptions we make in our mind streams that are negative or challenging. Why, we're really good at that. I'm not sure why that is.
We're so good at protecting ourselves from the world, the moment.
And from from source,
and
which really desires for all of us to have a really damn good time. And for whatever reason, we've unlearned that and forgotten that. And then bringing it back to this agreement, we start to write these stories that really aren't true, making assumptions about ourselves and other people. And there we are. And the fourth one, which is probably the most self-explanatory and probably the easiest to talk about, is always do your best. Now, this is something that, we learn as kids when mom and dad, go do your best and make sure you look your best and act your best and do your best at school. But I think that the wider definition of this, and that what Don Miguel talked about more in the book, is really to show up in like your fullest, truest way, like your most authentic way, number one. and also your most well-meaning and most well-intended and most honest way. Is that how you interpret it?
I do. And again, not so easy, but something to strive for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So showing up in your best way really brings me to the Buddhist concept of learn how to be a good friend to yourself.
I
So
love this one.
if you're a good friend to yourself, you'll be a good friend to other people, right? If you're a horrible friend to yourself, more than likely you'll be a horrible friend to others. So in a way, it's very simple, and another way, it's very difficult to learn how to be a great supporter, a good mentor, a good teacher, a good friend to yourself.
And I guess the Buddhist statement, or at least the interpretation of that is, would you treat your best friend the way you're treating yourself? Would you say that to your best friend the way you're saying it to yourself?
Exactly.
It's so, again, so concrete and so easy to understand, and yet not our default. Also, before we get to our action steps, I had the pleasure of, I met Miguel a few times, and I interviewed him once many years ago after an event in New Jersey. And that was the one thing that really stood out for me, what you just said. I probably was asking him the same thing I'm still obsessing about all these years later, like, why are we so good at deviating from the simple things that get us into flow and happiness? And how do we realign with that flow? And he just put his hand, I think it was like his hand over his heart, something like that, or on his, I think it was like on his chest or his heart. It just said, love yourself, just, be your friend. I'm like, what? I understand what that means. I understood what it meant at the time, but I didn't get the full scope of the understanding of that the way I do. And it's coming and stemming from the same thing that you just shared about the Buddhist belief system, right?
Be a good friend to yourself, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That I've held dear to me for a long, long time, right?
Yeah. So before we get to our action steps, I know you might be jumping out of your chair to share another one of your amazing stories, and we can probably have like a, maybe a 2-minute story if you want to share one. Did you have a?
Well, after I had that experience in the Palace of the Jaguar,
Was there anything up from there? I mean,
well, it was
that's something.
actually kind of riveting after that, because I was in an altered state of consciousness, by the way, without any drugs whatsoever. And Don Miguel was holding me like a mother for about 45 minutes. And I was in tears, and he was a very motherly person, beautiful. And he said, when you can, you and these two other people, I want you to climb the Pyramid of the Moon. And at that point, I just started laughing hysterically because I couldn't even walk, right? Pyramid of the Moon has steps that are so steep that even in sobriety, you can't hardly climb. You have to go up with your hands.
Right. Really shallow too.
Really? You've been
Right.
up
Like
there?
not there, but I've been to plenty of other of those indigenous civilizations and their temples and iconic buildings, and it's always universally shallow steps.
So I got to the top of the Pyramid of the Moon. Don Miguel was up there, and he said, I want you to look with your other eyes again and look down all the courtyards from where you've come. And I started hearing screams of humanity. I was overwhelmed, again in tears, from a completely different perspective of the pain, suffering, and unhappiness of humanity. And I realized that every scream was the distance that people were away from God, from
Wow.
Source. The louder the scream, the further they were from Source.
Wow.
And at that, I know we're almost over here. At that point, Don Miguel told me later, he said, you could have left then. Left meaning I could have been done with my earth experience, but I had made a decision to take what I learned there at Teotihuacan, take it home, and try to be of service to humanity.
Beautiful. So powerful. We might have to do a second show so we can really follow up on this. I'm going to jump into our action steps. I hate to so quickly segue away. I just want to make sure that we get everything in. First agreement for be impeccable with your word. Select a person in your life that you're not communicating with truthfully. Write down why you're afraid of being impeccable with that person and think about if your fear is justified or not. Number 2, if you feel comfortable with facing your fear, tell that person what you really think. Be impeccable. Thirdly, don't take anything personally. We take so many things personally that don't belong to us. So try to write down 3 things that you've taken personally that you want to let go of. And finally, in terms of not making assumptions, because we all do you have a few that you'd like to throw into the trash bin of history? Can you identify them by writing them down on a small piece of paper and then burn them ritualistically? So we're going to put these action steps on our Instagram, as we always do, after the show. So you'll be able to see those. And I will repeat them super quickly one more time. With impeccable with your words, select a person in your life where you're not communicating truthfully. Think about and write down why you're afraid. And then secondly, if you feel comfortable facing your fear, tell that person what you think. Thirdly, in terms of not taking anything personally, try to think about 3 things that you've taken personally that you want to let go of. And finally, with assumptions, do you have some assumptions that you've made that you want to write down, ritualistically burn, and purge them from your consciousness forever? So those are our offerings today. What a rich, I could listen to your stories forever. And we hope that we've offered people a little bit more of a special perspective. I want to thank everybody for listening to us. You can find us on Instagram at One Soul Radio, Facebook, One Soul Radio Podcast. We're going to start up our YouTube channel very, very soon, and this will be our first show. Steve, where is your story? It can be found. The name of it is on Audible.
Journey to Teotihuacan on Audible and Amazon.
And if you want to see my interview with Don Miguel Ruiz, just Google YouTube, my name and Don Miguel Ruiz. It'll pop up. Next week, the 5 love languages. Join us again. Thanks, everybody.